History as it happens, April 9th, 2024. Still bombing Baghdad.
3 U.S. soldiers have been killed in a drone attack on an American base in Jordan near the Syrian border.
U.S. bases in the Middle East have been hit over 100 times.
Known as the Axis of Resistance, there's a number of pro-Iranian militias based in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, the Palestinian territories, and as far as south as Yemen.
So the attacks that have taken place since October on our forces, on our personnel in both Iraq and Syria have been conducted by groups that are aligned with Iran and indeed are supported by Iran.
The U.S. has launched airstrikes on targets inside Iraq and Syria in retaliation for the deaths of 3 U.S. soldiers.
Killed a leader of a group that struck American forces for years and was a target of the first American strikes last
month. An American airstrike killing the leader of an Iranian-backed militia in Baghdad.
Why are U.S. forces still in Iraq and Syria? Who is attacking U.S. bases there? And who is the U.S. military trying to kill with drone strikes in Baghdad? And what does Iraq's government say about it? More than 21 years after getting rid of Saddam Hussein, then fighting al-Qaeda in Iraq, then ISIS, and now the armed groups that helped the U.S. defeat ISIS. Renaud Mansour has the answers next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
The read we get on the people of Iraq is there's no question but what they want to get rid of Saddam Hussein, and they will welcome as liberators the United States.
Leaving Saddam Hussein in possession of weapons of mass destruction for a few more months or years is not an option.
The transition from dictatorship to democracy will take time, but it is worth every effort. Our coalition will stay until our work is done.
The U.S. has struggled in Iraq because oftentimes it's been a military solution for what we're describing is a socio-political problem. Time and time again, the easy option is to bomb or to sanction.
The headline came and went in early February, blending in with hundreds of stories since October 7 about the violence rippling across the Middle East. Here it is. A U.S. military strike in Baghdad killed a Kataib Hezbollah commander who was responsible for attacks on American forces in the region, according to U.S. Central Command. About a month earlier, a similar headline. The U.S. military launched a retaliatory strike in Baghdad that killed a militia leader for recent attacks on U.S. personnel, the Pentagon said, a move condemned by Iraq's government.
And finally, I can confirm that on January 4 at approximately 12 p.m. Iraq time, U.S. forces took necessary and proportionate action against Mushtaq Jawad Kazim al-Jawari, a.k.a. Abu Taqwa, who is a Harakat al-Najuba leader. Abu Taqwa was actively involved in planning and carrying out attacks against American personnel. The strike also killed another Han member. It is important to note that the strike was taken in self-defense, that no civilians were harmed, and that no infrastructure or facilities were struck.
We'll return to what the Iraqi government thinks of the U.S. airstrikes in a moment. But you know what all this makes me think of? Whether anyone who watched President George W. Bush deliver these remarks May 1st, 2003, aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln, anticipated that the U.S. would still be at war in Iraq today.
Major combat operations in Iraq have ended. In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed.
And this too.
Because of you, our nation is more secure. Because of you, the tyrant has fallen and Iraq is free.
Iraq is not free today, according to Freedom House, an organization that tracks this sort of thing. It says Iraq holds regular competitive elections and the country's various partisan, religious, and ethnic groups generally enjoy representation in the political system. However, democratic governance is impeded in practice by corruption, militias operating outside the bounds of the law, and the weakness of formal institutions. Iraq falls into the not free category with poor rankings in both political and civil liberties. And Iraq is still not at peace. The U.S. continues to wage war there, although a different war than the one whose outcome Bush celebrated in 2003. Saddam Hussein's hollowed-out military did not last long, but today the U.S. is at odds with armed groups that once helped American forces fight ISIS when it took over much of Iraq after 2014.
Still, we continue to face a terrorist threat. We can't erase every trace of evil from the world, and small groups of killers have the capacity to do great harm. That was the case before 9/11, and that remains true today. And that's why we must remain vigilant as threats emerge. At this moment, the greatest threats come from the Middle East and North Africa, where radical groups exploit grievances for their own gain. And one of those groups is ISIL, which calls itself the Islamic State.
So the militias in Iraq today, they fought alongside the United States against ISIS last decade. Some of them are aligned with Iranian interests. Some are focused on the Iraqi state. Whatever the case, the U.S. cannot kill its way out of this problem, which should be obvious by now. A spokesman for Iraqi Prime Minister Mohammed al-Sudani has said the U.S. airstrikes are unacceptable and a violation of Iraqi sovereignty. He called on the international community to prevent aggressions against the country's stability. Iraq's prime minister will make his first official state visit to Washington April 15th. This meeting is made possible by a ceasefire in Iraq. How long it'll last, I can't say, but if hostilities erupt again, that would complicate negotiations to secure a U.S. withdrawal from Iraq. Of course, every day the U.S. has troops there is another day they can be targeted by these hostile militias. As Renaud Mansour writes in Foreign Affairs, the official publication of the Council on Foreign Relations, these groups are politically, economically, militarily, and ideologically entrenched in their states, and are united by their shared opposition to foreign occupation. U.S. forces, he says, have attacked these groups in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, killing their senior leaders and destroying their trading hubs and weapons depots. Washington has also sanctioned their banks and businesses. But these strikes and punitive measures, described by a senior U.S. official as whack-a-mole, have not been successful in securing peace or stability. The groups that Washington targeted have not gone away. Mansour goes on to say, instead they have flourished, becoming even more powerful within their countries and the wider region. Washington has proved itself unable to tackle the true sources of these groups' power, which lie not in military infrastructure alone, but in the social and political structures of the Middle East. Armed groups thrive under fragile governments, and their networks include cabinet ministers, parliamentarians, judges, senior bureaucrats, and civil society organizers. Mansour concludes Washington's use of violence and of sanctions has done little to dampen the strength of these groups or to diminish their power. This is because bombs and sanctions do not produce political reform. Again, this essay appeared in Foreign Affairs. I will put a link to it, paywall-free, in my weekly newsletter. You can sign up for that at historyasithappens.com, or you can find History As It Happens on Substack. I'll also embed a link to Brown University's Costs of War project, so you can see just how much money, among many other things, the war in Iraq continues to cost the United States. It's hundreds of millions of dollars a year. Renaud Mansour is a senior research fellow and project director of the Iraq Initiative at Chatham House. Hello and welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Joining us from the United Kingdom. So most Americans probably don't think about Iraq very much anymore, or seriously question why U.S. forces are still there 21 years after the toppling of Saddam Hussein. But before we get into that, why don't we just take the view from 30,000 feet? What is going on in Iraq right now with respect to these armed groups?
Certainly, over the last 21 years, the question you raise has been asked. Why are the U.S. still there? And there have been at different moments attempts by the Americans to leave and to focus elsewhere. To look, for example, most recently, as you say, Iraq is no longer in the news. The U.S., many Western, let's say European countries were looking at Ukraine or Russia or China, pivoting away from the Middle East. And yet they always seem to be drawn back in, pulled back into the Middle East, pulled back into Iraq in particular. In this most recent iteration, the context of post-October 7th, so, Hamas's attack on October 7th on Israel and Israel's bombardment of Gaza has escalated throughout the region. This conflict has spilled across Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. And so you have armed groups in Iraq that are part of what's known as the Axis of Resistance. They view their role as fighting against American imperialism, but also Israeli sort of imperialism, and they see the two together. They see this axis between the U.S. and Israel. And so you've had an increase in attacks since October 7th, the back and forth, tit for tat. Most recent, of course, Israel killed a very senior Iranian general, Zahidi, in the Iranian sort of embassy in Damascus. But you've had basically attacks back and forth. So these armed groups exist in Iraq. They are a symptom of the inability to create a coherent state in the wake of the U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq.
People who don't pay much attention to Iraq anymore maybe don't know just how serious the situation is there. There were anti-government protests a couple of years ago that were rather serious, threatened the stability of the country. But you still travel there frequently. You were just there in January. What is the position right now of the central government? I mean, I do want to talk about these armed groups that the U.S. had a sort of truce with last year, and that truce is, of course, breaking down right now. There are about 2,500 American troops in Iraq, 900 in Syria. The Prime Minister, Mohammed al-Sudani, to the point about retaliatory strikes by the United States against these armed groups that are, of course, attacking U.S. bases. Sudani says this is a violation of our sovereignty, and he wants the United States to leave.
And keep in mind that the U.S. troops are in Iraq by invitation of the Iraqi government. The mandate is in response to the Islamic State's rise and occupation of a third of Iraq. So that presence still goes back to ISIS. So ISIS has been territorially defeated. And, although there are still pockets of ISIS in Iraq and Syria, that battle is considered to be over. And so the Iraqi government now, as well as the American government, are trying to think, okay, well, what next? Why do we still have these U.S. troops there? From the perspective of, as you say, Sudani, the prime minister of Iraq, and the Iraqi government, it's this idea of projecting sovereignty. They want to project an Iraq that is normal. They want to say we don't need foreign troops anymore in our land. They're also looking at the UN and other institutions. They're trying to renegotiate an Iraq so that it's no longer seen as this country that's invaded and occupied, but it's just a normal country. And so what the Iraqi government wants to do, what Sudani wants to do, and he will be going to Washington to meet with President Biden and others, is basically to make this point that we need bilateral relations. We don't want to have no relations with the U.S. In fact, the contrary. Sudani and the Iraqi government want to continue to maintain good relations with the U.S. They just want to structure it in a different way that makes it seem like Iraq has more sovereignty.
So I'm assuming the reason why we just simply can't leave is because of the presence of these armed groups. But isn't our presence the catalyst for the violence?
It's a tricky scenario that the U.S. and its allies have gotten themselves in, partly, of course, a consequence of U.S. actions and the history in the region. You mentioned there has been truce. These ceasefires, they just don't seem to stick. These military sort of accomplishments and victories don't seem to be sustained. So every U.S. president, since George Bush famously declared mission accomplished 6 weeks after the invasion in 2003.
We thank all the citizens of Iraq who welcomed our troops and joined in the liberation of their own country. And tonight, I have a special word for Secretary Rumsfeld, for General Franks, and for all the men and women who wear the uniform of the United States. America is grateful for a job well done.
Every U.S. president has had some kind of victory in Iraq, and yet it's not a complete victory. It's not a sustained victory. And because of that, the U.S. and Washington feels every few years that it gets pulled back in. And so these armed groups aren't necessarily the problem in and of themselves, but I think what they are is a symptom. They represent a problem in Iraq, which is that the state is incoherent. It's unclear. Power is diffused. And within that, as you say, you have a big population, a growing population, one of the biggest youth populations in the region. In fact, the population of Iraq will double from 2003 very soon. And the political system set up in 2003 is just unable to govern.
Yeah, the youth were behind the protests I mentioned before. These armed groups, you said it before, ISIS took over a large part of Iraq starting in around, 2014 or so? President Obama called them the JV team.
We know that if we are joined by the international community, we can continue to shrink ISIL's sphere of influence, its effectiveness, its financing, its military capabilities, to the point where it is a manageable problem.
The Iraqi army, despite having, a gazillion dollars spent on it, U.S. taxpayer money, crumbled in the face of ISIS. So these armed groups came together, and they came together under an umbrella that you call the Popular Mobilization Forces. Some of these groups are now attacking the United States. I'll mention a couple of their names. Kataib Hezbollah, Harakat Hezbollah al-Nujaba, and Kataib Saeed al-Shuhada. They operate in Iraq and Syria, which of course share a border. Now, I think maybe some people just picture a bunch of guys with AK-47s and RPGs. But as you write, these aren't just, ragtag militias. They are politically, economically, militarily, and ideologically entrenched in their states and are united by their shared opposition to foreign occupation.
As you rightfully point out, these are not just men with guns. These are groups that are intimately connected to the state in the countries in which they operate. So these groups, like Kataib Hezbollah or Harakat al-Nujaba, they are part of the Popular Mobilization Forces. They were the front line. They were the first responders when ISIS rose in Iraq. So this Iraqi military that was funded and developed for over a decade by the U.S. crumbled overnight. And these groups were able to defend the state. They've also been on the front line defending the Iraqi state from protest and other threats that have tried to bring down the political system. So while many people refer to these types of groups as non-state actors or hybrid actors or even militias, those categories don't do justice to what the reality is in these groups. They are connected. They have parliamentarians. They have local council officials. They have governors. They have businesses. They are part and parcel of the Iraqi state. They might not look like the kind of state that many in the US or Europe would think about in terms of a state as monopoly over violence and what came out of European history. The reality on the ground is they are not only the state, but they are often the ones doing the state, whether it's protecting the government against terrorists in a way or providing services and all of this, right? That's not to say they're succeeding all the time, and they are failing, but they very much are more than men with guns.
And the central governments, such as they are, rely on them, really can't get rid of them. There's a symbiotic relationship, if I can use that term.
That's right. The structure of the Iraqi government, the president, the prime minister, they're some of the weakest people in the political process. Power does not lie in the government in Iraq. It lies across society and across these groups. So this is the challenge. This is the challenge of the political system that was set up after 2003. And this is why that kind of peace that we talk about is never really sustained. It's because you don't have coherent decision making. You don't have coherent structures of governing. And the prime minister is meant to be a weak, compromised candidate that has no authority over these very powerful elites.
And your argument is the U.S. can't bomb its way out of this problem. I want people to focus on what you just said, that the elected leaders of Iraq are among the weakest in the power structure there. So do these groups in Iraq control sectors of the economy as well?
Of course. They're very much just like any other group of elites. In Iraq, there are political elites who have proxies across government ministries that could allow them to procure contracts. Keep in mind that Iraq is a very wealthy rentier state. I mean, the state budget of Iraq is well over $100 billion a year. So there's a lot of money, which brings a lot of opportunity. And the name of the game is to generate revenue out of state coffers. So these groups both have their, connections to state companies, connections to contracts across ministries, across different sectors, but also they also will have private companies. So they're very much business elites as well.
One of these groups was behind that attack in Jordan, where the 3 American service members were killed. So the Biden administration retaliated with some bombing. And you're saying that this didn't work. It's actually making the situation worse. What have been the consequences there?
The U.S. has struggled in Iraq because oftentimes it's been a military solution for what we're describing is a socio-political problem. Time and time again, the easy option is to bomb or to sanction. So the U.S. have killed the senior leaders of these groups, including, not just when Iranian General Qasem Soleimani was killed in January 2020, alongside him killed was Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, who was the leader of the PMF, the Popular Mobilization Forces. So the U.S. have killed their leaders. The U.S. have continued to bomb their weapons depots across the borders between Iraq and Syria. They've sanctioned most of their leaders and their banks, and yet these groups maintain their power. Just as we're discussing, they maintain their connections to the state. So one of the consequences, it's not just that bombings aren't working, but sometimes they have backlash, they have repercussions. So killing someone like Qasem Soleimani or Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis led to a region where you have the proliferation of many other armed groups that aren't centralized. There isn't a single commander or a single person who's able to control them. And so Kitab Hezbollah, for example, it's been argued that Kitab Hezbollah has become more freewheeling in the context of the U.S. removing its leader. And because of that, if you look at the recent killing of the 3 American service members in Jordan in Tower 22 by Kitab Hezbollah, there are other leaders in the PMU and Iran that were against this, that did not want this to happen, and that demanded that Kitab Hezbollah declare a ceasefire immediately after this. And the Biden administration's response was to bomb these groups. There was a bomb in Baghdad, but also across the border between Iraq and Syria.
Think about that for a second. 21 years after getting rid of Saddam Hussein, we're bombing Baghdad again.
President Biden is now vowing to respond after a drone attack killed 3 U.S. soldiers in Jordan. The big question this morning, what will that response look like?
A major strike by the United States on a militia leader right in the center of Baghdad.
So the retaliation from the Biden administration, it's been a long time coming. Since the middle of October, pro-Iranian militias have attacked U.S. forces 118 times.
And yes, you point out the assassination of Soleimani in January 2020 under the Trump administration. Most people probably didn't realize at the time that Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, your pronunciation of Arabic is better than mine, Renat, by the way. Yeah, he was there too. He was the leader of the Popular Mobilization Forces. So why would these groups that once fought alongside the United States against ISIS trust the United States when their leaders are being killed?
ISIS brought so many different groups together. I mean, everyone was against ISIS. The Russians were fighting ISIS, the Americans are fighting ISIS, the Iranians are fighting ISIS, and of course, many of these Iraqi armed groups were fighting ISIS. But as soon as there was that victory over ISIS, and particularly under US President Trump, there was this push towards what became known as the maximum pressure on Iran. And of course, Iraq is the playground for where much of this happens. The US and Iran will not compete in Iran or the US. They will compete and fire at each other inside Iraq. That's been the case for many years now. So these groups became part of that Iranian side. They're allied to Iran. They share very strong histories with Iran. At times, they sort of work with Iran very closely, including during the fight against ISIS. But the weapons were turned on each other. So the U.S. was now in conflict with many of these groups. And there were these tit-for-tat attacks. Periodically, you will have ceasefires, but they never seem to hold. I think it's a puzzle that the U.S. just has not been able to solve.
Well, these groups are Shia. So when the U.S. toppled the secular Sunni counterbalance to Iran in that region, Saddam Hussein, it's no surprise that Iran would then have influence in a Shia majority country. Who has more influence in Baghdad right now, Washington or Tehran?
I mean, it's been the case for many, many years now that, of course, Tehran is the most powerful foreign player in Baghdad. And that's not to say that Iran is all powerful. And there are times when Iran is still negotiating and trying to push its interest. And, many of these Iraqi groups, yes, they might be Shia, but they're also Iraqi and they also have their own interests. And sometimes their interests go against Iran's interests. So it's a constant negotiation.
Yeah, I should have
between
mentioned, sorry to
these
interrupt,
two.
Renaud, but those protests in 2019, I believe, were also against Iranian influence in the country.
Yes, and certainly across, especially the south of Iraq and the sort of Shia heartland of Iraq, there has been a growing movement that sees Iran as the occupier now. So those who were kind of crying out against American occupation in the early years are now crying out against Iran, because Iran is now in different ways so influential, and yet the government, which Iran is influential over, but the government of Iraq is just unable to provide basic services. People don't have electricity as much as they need. They don't have good medicine. They don't have clean water. Many people are still struggling. And so who are they to blame? They blame the government and its most senior backers, including, of course, Iran.
Yeah, you say here that some of these groups see themselves as part of a wider transnational pan-Shia vanguard struggle in partnership with Iran to support allies, including the Assad regime in Syria, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the Houthis in Yemen. However, there are some of these PMF groups, Popular Mobilization Forces, that the United States is working with. So we're not bombing all of them. We are actually trying to get some of them to reach an accommodation that we would approve of with the central government in Baghdad. Talk a little bit about who we're working with there, these groups that you say are more focused on the Iraqi state itself.
Yeah, the United States has realized that there is a sort of way that politics is done in Iraq and that there needs to be compromises, and they view it almost as a marketplace. But in any case, some of these groups are interested in becoming powerful in Iraq and are worried about the regional escalation that causes backlash and American strikes and potentially Israeli strikes. Right now, especially under the current government, some of these groups feel like things are going well for them. They're becoming even more powerful, even more state actors, groups such as the Badr organization led by Hadi al-Amiri or As-Sahab Ahl al-Haq led by Qais al-Khazali. These groups are very much have a domestic Iraq agenda for them to try and become powerful. They're the ones that are trying to tell the groups you mentioned earlier, like Kitab, Hezbollah, and others, cut it out. That's enough of this transnational. Like, you need a ceasefire because you're kind of jeopardizing what we have here. To get to your question, the Americans have, for many years now, tried to take advantage of these different groups. They've tried to play one off of the other.
That's dangerous.
Exactly. It's divide and conquer in a way. And the U.S. have tried to find, okay, well, there are certain groups that are loyal to Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani, who is the most senior Shia leader based in Najaf. Okay, these are groups who we should support. We should, develop them in a way, hoping that their development would allow those that we don't like to be weakened. That hasn't happened. The U.S. has tried other times to go to some of these senior PMF leaders like Hadi al-Amiri or others and kind of co-opt them to say, okay, we will help you, we will give you support to bring down the resistance transnational group. So there are attempts by the U.S. to try and navigate at times these networks, but it's never really been sustainable. It's been trying to play a game that I think the U.S. is unable to, and I think many argue should not be playing.
Oh, sighing in frustration there. I'm sorry just hearing this because when I spoke to Gaith Abdul-Ahad last year about his book, he talked about the possibility of more sectarian civil war kind of conflict breaking out in Iraq again. I do remember Ali al-Sistani, the most important Shia religious figure in Iraq. When I say I remember him, I remember reading about him for the first time during the aftermath of the 2003 invasion. He is now 93 years old. How important a figure is he at holding all this together?
He is still quite influential. He has a lot of religious power. I think he has struggled in the political field at times in the last 21 years. For example, when ISIS rose and took over so much of Iraq in 2014, Sistani issued a fatwa. A fatwa is a religious ruling calling on all able-bodied men to volunteer to fight against ISIS. The PMU leadership took that fatwa in a way and used it to say, we now have a religious ruling from Sistani for us to create what we want, which is these armed groups and this umbrella organization. Sistani did not want that to happen. In fact, Sistani would have preferred that these groups joined the government the state in a way. But that didn't happen. And so many would view the aftermath of that fatwa as not going the way that Sistani wanted. So he's still very powerful and certainly very powerful religiously and has a way of bringing society together. But I think he, like others, struggles really in the political field of post-2003 Iraq.
So I mentioned before how Iraq's Prime Minister al-Sudani, he has said publicly he wants the United States to leave because of these violations of Iraqi sovereignty, the bombing of these groups in Iraq. But the Iraqi government has also invited the United States to stay, and there have been negotiations going on now for several months about ultimately how will the United States leave. The United States is staying for now. Maybe one reason for that is, you would know better than I, Iraq's leaders are worried what would happen if the United States did leave. Case in point, your research paper that you wrote for Chatham House, and I'll put a link to this paper in my weekly newsletter. Title is Responding to Instability in Iraq's Sinjar District. Sinjar District is a small place in northern Iraq next to Syria where there is no central government control. And you're saying this tiny place is turning into a transnational hub for, well, instability. Competing groups from Turkey, because Turkey's nearby. Kurdish groups are using Sinjar. I mean, what's going on there, and why can't the central government control it? I know I just threw a lot at you there, so take that one layer, one layer at a time.
Basically, it's very hard to confine a conflict to the boundaries of a country. These sort of artificial boundaries that were created in the Middle East, countries like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, conflict is not confined to these borders. And so we want to interrogate that a bit more. We want to understand, okay, well, what can this tell us about conflict and then how response to conflict needs to look like? And so we found this tiny place in northwestern Iraq called Sinjar, which has become a massive hub of conflict. Sinjar is where the Yazidis lived when ISIS took over and committed the genocide against the Yazidi women in the summer of 2014. Many of these displaced people have not yet returned to their homes in Sinjar. They still live in camps in the neighboring Duhok province of the Kurdistan region. Instead, what you have in Sinjar is these different armed groups that operate transnationally. Their conflict zones aren't stuck to one country. So, for example, the PKK, this is an organization that fights for Kurdish nationalist rights that Turkey has recognized as a terrorist organization. The PKK operates in Turkey, Iraq, and Syria. But Sinjar is so important for the PKK. It's a mountain, it's protection, it's all crucial supply trading routes is where Sinjar is. So it's a tiny place, but it's so geostrategic. In a similar light, the other group that we've been talking about today, the Popular Mobilization Units, they've also recognized that Sinjar is important as part of the axis of resistance, because we also know that the axis of resistance operates across Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon. Previously, they used to use the deserts, in places like Al-Qa'im between Iraq and Syria, but that exposed them to bombs and exposed them to US drones and all of that. Sinjar is a safer place for them to build this land bridge that they're looking to build that connect the region. So that's what the paper looks at. The paper looks at this reality that conflict is transnational, but also what does this actually mean, therefore, for the US or other countries that are investing so much money, but don't seem to be getting very far with it. The Iraqi government, by the way, they actually built a wall between Iraq and Syria. They built a wall on the border to try and stop, but of course, these walls don't work. Instead, what the walls ended up stopping were medicine and food and clothing from going across borders, but it certainly didn't stop these armed groups from going back and forth. So there has been so many negative repercussions from that.
So even though the end game is supposed to be the U.S. leaving Iraq at some point, for now it sounds like the Iraqi government wants the U.S. to stay, those 2,500 troops, because of problems like this one. They can't control all of their sovereign territory, and in Sinjar, it is a cause of violence and instability.
The Iraqi government want the U.S. there for several reasons. One, the Iraqi government does not want to turn into a pariah state that's sanctioned, that restricts its access to international markets. It doesn't want to be another Iran. So it needs to have good relations with the US, with European countries. This is important. But of course, it also wants to benefit in ways of how the US could help. If that is, as you say, on the military side or capacity building side. Also keep in mind that you also have NATO and other organizations in Iraq trying to do security sector reform and all of these initiatives. From the perspective of the Iraqi government, the Sudani government, this is all good. What now is happening is more of a choreography. This is a theater. The prime minister wants to sell to his people that he managed to get out the American troops. He doesn't want to end relations with the US. He wants to maintain relations with the US and might actually invite US back at some point for specific things. But it's how do you choreograph US withdrawal? From the US perspective, from the Biden perspective, they're on the same page. They also want to choreograph how do we leave Iraq so it doesn't look like another Afghanistan. It doesn't look like we're being bombed out or that we're running away and therefore this grand international state building project that we endeavored didn't work. So both sides have the exact same end goal. And yet it's that choreography that has just become more complicated in a post-October 7th Middle East.
You mentioned the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK. There is a Kurdish nation. There is no Kurdish state. Turkey has bombed PKK targets in northern Iraq. And this happened in 2020. Iraq bombed by Turkey, but it really wasn't Iraq itself. It was bombing this ungoverned area. And also you point out here how some of these armed groups under the PMF have operated across Sinjar and Iraq's borders with Syria. To your point about this being a transit hub as part of the Islamic resistance in Iraq, which you say violently challenges U.S. influence in the region. Why do you think the U.S. can still fix this?
And I mean, that's a very difficult question. And all historical precedent would say that the US cannot fix this. And I do think that it's very, very unlikely that the US does not fix this or cannot fix this. However, there is a reality here, right? Whenever the US has tried to withdraw, they've been sucked back in. When the Obama administration in 2011 tried to leave Iraq, only a few years later, they were drawn back in because this is a mess partly in their making. So there is a reality that the US in different ways will continue to intervene in Iraq. If it's not militarily, it's certainly economically, politically, and so on. And so if we have to come to that, we have to sort of understand that there will be U.S. in different ways influence in Iraq, and the U.S. will continue to try and claim that it's trying to fix this problem. Where are the channels or where are the areas in which the U.S. could play a role? And it certainly isn't in the bombing or the sanctions and these problems. One thing that has been a gap for the last 21 years is this point on accountability. These states are not accountable. There aren't checks and balances. And you have a growing youth population in Iraq that doesn't feel like this system set up 21 years ago represents them or responds to their basic needs. And that is where, if the U.S. is going to have to be doing something, it should focus its attention on ensuring accountability to this public. And so that's the kind of conclusion on the piece. And, I think you're right. And I've had, people email me after I wrote the piece telling me, this is all great, but it doesn't seem very realistic. And I think that's right. But this is the reality in which we are trying to think through some of these very difficult and challenging problems.
One more question for you, Renan, because you made a point before that I wanted to return to about how you can't confine conflict to the borders of a state, especially when these borders are artificial, going back to the settlement of World War I. And I think this is an important point because of so much of the discourse today is about nation states and kind of this 19th century idea of great power competition. But what we're seeing in the Middle East right now, not just in Iraq, but in Lebanon and Gaza and in Yemen, it's not just about nation states. That type of framing misses the reality that you're explaining here on the ground. We have to look at these groups not as a bunch of terrorists that we can wipe out, but that are part of, the political reality.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So these states, both in terms of their physical borders, but also in terms of that sort of border between government and society, is far more blurred than what, the experience of the 19th century European states would suggest. And for a long time, the colonial powers and the neo-colonial powers went to the Middle East looking to keep these states, to continue to double down on these borders when in many places it's not working. As you mentioned the Kurds, for example. I mean, the Kurds in Iraq, for example, they have their own government, they have their own land, and yet they won't be recognized. A big portion of the conflict and the struggles in the Middle East is still a reaction to those decisions made 100 years ago of what these countries would look like, but also what these governing systems would look like. When you look at conflict, when you look at the era of globalization in which we live in which everything is so connected, it's hard to talk about the Iraq war as only an Iraq war, or any war for that matter, as confined to the country in which that conflict has erupted.
Our coalition will stay until our work is done, and then we will leave, and we will leave behind a free Iraq.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, we're going to stay in this area. Who is ISIS-K, the terrorist group, the militia that sprouted up out of the cascading disasters caused by the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003? We're going to be joined by Peter Bergen next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.